Good morning, church family. This morning we are continuing through the book of Genesis in our deep dive daily Devo videos. And in this chapter we read today, we see Abram come across a specific trial. And I think we can all agree that when we're faced with trials, we don't always have the best response. Whether the trial be the loss of a loved one, health issues, finances, we don't always respond with faithfulness to God. We don't always respond with dependence upon Him. We sometimes seek our own solutions and instead try to keep it in our control, in our hands, and figure it out instead of truly giving up control and truly resting. And so when we pick up here in Genesis chapter 10, we see what happens is Abram is in the land of Canaan and the land encounters famine. And in the face of this famine, Abram decides to go to Egypt to seek refuge there until the famine passes. And this is because the land of Canaan and its crops was very dependent upon rainfall. And so when the rain isn't happening, the land of Canaan was not as prosperous. Meanwhile, Egypt had a little more ability to remain prosperous because of the source of the Nile helping the crops. And we see this trend of famine. It faces Abram's son Isaac, it faces Jacob, and we see that we know that Jacob down the road also eventually seeks refuge in in Egypt in the face of trial. But what we see here is Abram decides, we're going to go to Egypt, we're going to seek refuge there. But something happens when he's already rattled by this trial of this famine, and he's going to Egypt, and with the trial already happening, he begins to face fear. He faces fear that, when they notice my beautiful wife, the Pharaoh of Egypt's going to want to take her for his own, and he's going to kill me. And so in the face of this fear of famine, in the face of this fear of what the Pharaoh of Egypt might do, he decides to forge the deceit. He decides to say, Sarai, don't present yourself as my wife. Instead, present yourself as my sister. And we see, instead of trusting God to defend him, he instead puts his wife, Sarai, in a dangerous position. Not only is he risking her not being protected or honored by what Pharaoh might do with her, but he's also not respecting God's promise that he said, I will give you a promised child through your wife, Sarai. So in his fear, he kind of casts aside his wife and saying, hey, say you're my sister. That way if they take you, I'll still live. But he wasn't defending her, and he wasn't truly defending God's promise of a child through Sarai. Instead, in his fear, he said, hey, just say you're my sister. That way I'll be safe. Not really taking into consideration what Pharaoh might do to her and how this is showing a lack of faith in God, not only to protect him in this moment, but a lack of faith in God to provide his promise, period. And we see what happens because of his lack of faith. God has to step in, and despite his lack of faith, God steps in and defends Sarai. God kind of makes these plagues fall before the Pharaoh and his family, and they're kind of befelled with illness. And we see Pharaoh eventually figures it out, and he's like, Abram, here's your wife. Why would you lie to me? Why would you deceive me? And then we see that as a result, Abram is cast out of Egypt. He's cast out of this place in which he was trying to seek refuge in the famine. So because Abram did not have faith in God, God still defended Sarai, but he faced the consequences of that lack of faith in being cast out of Egypt. So the conclusion to learn from this passage is that we need to faithfully trust in God instead of seeking our own solutions, instead of seeking our wisdom, our way out, our control. Instead of being willing to trust, God will protect me in Sarai. He'll protect me from Pharaoh when he sees Sarai's beauty. Instead, he was like, I'll just play it safe and, just say you're my sister. That way, if he takes you, I'll be fine. And instead of trusting in God's faithful provision, he made his own way that was incomplete and did not take into consideration his wife nor the promise of the child to come through his wife. And so, church family, I think we often face this same situation, and we react similarly to Abram if we're honest. We're not faced with the situation of I'm going to say my wife's my sister, but what we're faced with is situations that look scary, and we often react with, this is my solution because I don't trust God to actually provide on his. And so, church family, I challenge you, take steps to be dependent upon God in trial. It doesn't mean we don't diligently seek to work in the trial, but it's in all things, Lord, we trust in your provision, in your ability to guide us. And we won't seek it in our hands and our control. Instead, we trust in the God that you are and faithfully rest in you through all that we might face. Have a good morning, church family. See you next time.